Dominic Vane, the Duke of Wrenwick, had spent 11 years becoming the kind of man who could sit across from a stranger and ruin her life with perfect courtesy. He did not think of it that way, of course. He thought of it as strategy. He thought of it as justice. He thought of it as the thing he had owed his father since the autumn of 1806, when Marcus Vane had stood in the study of the very house Dominic now occupied and put a pistol to his own temple because he could not bear to live as a man whose name had been made worthless by a liar. Dominic had been 19. He had heard the shot from the stables. He had walked through the rain to the study door, and he had opened it, and he had seen what a man looks like when shame has been allowed to finish its work. He had stood there for 4 full minutes before he moved. He counted them later, because counting was something he could control. 11 years, 4,000 days, give or take, and now he sat in the front parlour of a boarding house on Clerkenwell Road, wearing a deep forest green frock coat and an ivory linen cravat, his sandy blonde hair swept back from a forehead that revealed nothing, his pale green eyes steady and measuring, and he waited for the woman he intended to marry and destroy Lord Philip Maddox with. Her name was Marguerite Sinclair. She was 26 years old. She was the daughter of the late Edwin Sinclair, who had been until his death 3 years prior the most capable property solicitor in the county of Hertfordshire. She had honey-brown hair that fell in soft waves gathered loosely at the nape of her neck, and amber eyes that, according to the investigator Dominic had hired, missed very little and forgave even less. She was also, as of 9 days ago, without employment, without family, and without any reasonable prospect of either. Dominic knew all of this because he had arranged most of it. Not her father's death. That had been consumption, slow and merciless and entirely natural. But the solicitor's practice that had employed Marguerite as a clerk after her father's passing, the quiet arrangement that had allowed a woman to do the work of reading land records and tracing property boundaries, that practice had recently lost its lease. The landlord had received a better offer. Dominic did not feel guilty about this, because guilt was a luxury he had surrendered somewhere around year 4, when he had learned exactly how Lord Maddox had forged the deeds to Aldermere, the estate that had been in the Vane family for 6 generations and was now in Maddox's name, generating £1,200 a year in rents that should have been Dominic's father's legacy. The door opened. Marguerite Sinclair entered the parlour the way a woman enters a room when she suspects she is being evaluated, which is to say, she did not enter carefully. She entered with her shoulders level and her chin slightly raised and her hands at her sides rather than folded or fidgeting, and she looked directly at Dominic with the kind of attention that was neither hostile nor deferential, but simply present, the way a surveyor looks at a landscape before deciding what to measure first. She was wearing a fawn cotton day dress that had been mended at the left cuff and a cream wool shawl that was clean, but not new. Her boots were scuffed brown leather, practical and unlovely. She carried no reticule, no fan, no gloves. She carried a leather folio, the kind solicitors use, and she held it the way a soldier holds a rifle, with the casual certainty of someone who knows what it is for. It was the kind of entrance that made Dominic understand, in a single uncomfortable moment, that his investigator's report had not been complete. "Miss Sinclair," he said, rising. "Thank you for coming." "Your Grace." She did not curtsy. She inclined her head, briefly and without flourish, in the manner of a woman who has read enough contracts to know that formality is a negotiating tool, and she had not yet decided which position she was negotiating from. Dominic gestured to the chair opposite his. The parlour was small, barely furnished, with faded wallpaper in a pattern of trailing roses that had lost most of their colour to decades of afternoon sun. It smelled of lye soap and cold tea. It was not the kind of room in which a duke typically conducted business, and Dominic had chosen it precisely for that reason. He wanted her off balance. He wanted the contrast between his title and this setting to create a question in her mind, and he wanted to answer that question on his terms. "I will be direct," he said, once she had seated herself and placed the leather folio on her lap with the same care another woman might have given to a piece of embroidery. "I am in need of a wife. Specifically, I am in need of a wife who possesses a thorough understanding of property law, land boundaries, and the interpretation of estate survey records. I have been informed that you are perhaps the most qualified person in Hertfordshire for this particular set of requirements, and I have verified that information independently." He watched her face as he said this. He had expected surprise or suspicion, or the performative modesty that well-bred women deployed when confronted with a compliment that was also a proposition. What he got instead was something he had not anticipated. She looked at him the way she might have looked at a land deed that contained an irregularity. Not alarmed, not flattered. Interested, in the way that a person is interested when something does not quite add up and they intend to determine why. "You are proposing marriage," she said. It was not a question. "I am proposing a partnership. Marriage is the legal mechanism that makes the partnership enforceable." "And the nature of this partnership?" Dominic had rehearsed this. He had spent 2 evenings in his study on Grosvenor Square, refining the precise combination of truth and omission that would make the offer irresistible without revealing its true purpose. He needed her expertise. He needed her proximity to the disputed records. He needed, above all, the legitimacy that a wife would provide when he brought his case to the county assizes, because a married man with a settled household was taken more seriously by judges than a bachelor with a vendetta, and Dominic was, at present, both. "I am engaged in a legal dispute over an estate called Aldermere," he said. "It is a property of some 800 acres in the North Riding, which was seized from my family 11 years ago through what I believe to be forged land deeds. The current holder is Lord Philip Maddox. I intend to recover Aldermere through the courts, and I require someone who can read the original survey records, identify the discrepancies in the boundary descriptions, and present that evidence in a form that a judge will find compelling. And this requires marriage rather than employment because the records I need are held in the county archive, which permits access only to property holders and their immediate families. As my wife, you would have standing to request the original survey maps. As my clerk, you would not. It was true. It was even the primary reason. What he did not say was that the marriage would also bring Marguerite into Maddox's social orbit, because Wrenwick Hall and Aldermere shared a river boundary, and the Vanes and the Maddoxes had been neighbours for 3 generations, and a new Duchess of Wrenwick would be an object of intense curiosity to a man who had spent a decade enjoying the spoils of his fraud without consequence. Marguerite was quiet for a long time, the kind of quiet that is not emptiness but processing, the silence of a mind that is sorting variables and assigning weight. Dominic watched her hands. They were still on the folio. She did not fidget. She did not look away. She breathed evenly, and when she finally spoke, her voice was the same level tone it had been from the beginning. "What are your terms?" He had prepared a document. He produced it from his coat, a single folded page sealed with his crest in dark green wax. She took it, broke the seal with her thumb, and read it in silence. Her eyes moved across the page with the speed of someone who reads legal language natively, not translating it into common speech, but understanding it in its own grammar. The terms were generous. A settlement of £400 per annum, secured regardless of the outcome of the Aldermere case, a private suite at Wrenwick Hall, full access to the estate library and map room, no interference in her correspondence, her reading, or her movements. The marriage would be, he had written in his most careful hand, a partnership of purpose and mutual respect, with no obligations beyond those explicitly stated herein. She looked up, Her amber eyes held something that was not gratitude and not suspicion, but was closer to the expression of a woman who has found the irregularity in the deed and is now deciding whether to mention it or to file it away for later use. "You have gone to considerable trouble, Your Grace." "I have gone to necessary trouble, Miss Sinclair." "These terms are more than fair, which makes me wonder what is not written here." Dominic felt something shift in his chest, a sensation he identified only later as the first stirring of a problem he had not anticipated. He had planned for resistance. He had planned for negotiation. He had not planned for perception, for the quiet, undecorated intelligence of a woman who looked at a generous offer and understood that generosity, in the absence of affection, is almost always a form of compensation. "Nothing is hidden," he said. It was the first lie he told her, and it sat in his mouth like a stone. She studied him for 3 more seconds. Then she refolded the document, placed it inside her leather folio, and said, "I accept." They were married 11 days later in the chapel at Wrenwick Hall, with Mrs. Halford, the housekeeper, and Mr. Ives, the land surveyor, standing as witnesses. The ceremony took 14 minutes. The vicar read the service. Dominic placed a gold band on Marguerite's finger with steady hands and a face that revealed nothing except the controlled composure of a man who was executing a plan precisely as designed. Marguerite spoke her vows in the same clear, level voice she used for everything, and when it was done, she did not smile, and she did not cry. She looked at the ring on her hand the way she might have looked at a new instrument, a theodolite, or a measuring chain, something that had a specific function, and would be judged by how well it performed that function rather than by its beauty. Mrs. Halford, who had served the Vane family for 23 years, and who had watched Dominic grow from a gentle boy into a cold and purposeful man, stood in the chapel doorway with her hands folded and her expression carefully neutral, and thought to herself that this marriage smelled of strategy, not of love, and that strategy marriages ended one of 2 ways, in ruins or in something that surprised everyone, including the strategist. She hoped for the latter. She suspected the former. Wrenwick Hall was a large house, and Dominic had arranged it so that he and Marguerite could occupy it almost without encountering each other. Her suite was in the east wing, with views of the river and the willows, and, on clear days, the distant boundary line where Wrenwick land ended and Aldermere began. His rooms were in the west wing, with views of the stable yard and the road to the village. They met for dinner, which was served at 7 in a dining room that could seat 40, and in which 2 people at opposite ends of a polished oak table looked like characters in a painting about loneliness. The first 3 weeks passed this way. Marguerite spent her days in the map room, a long north-lit chamber on the ground floor that contained, in oak drawers and rolled leather cases, the entire cartographic history of the Wrenwick estate, going back to the reign of George II. She worked methodically, beginning with the earliest surveys and moving forward decade by decade, cross-referencing boundary stones, watercourse descriptions, and the precise legal language of each successive deed. She made notes in a small book with a brown leather cover. She worked in silence, and she worked with the focus of someone who understands that truth lives in detail and that detail requires patience. Dominic watched her. Not openly, not with the obvious surveillance of a man who distrusts his employee, but with the peripheral awareness of a man who has set a trap and is monitoring whether the mechanism is functioning as designed. He would pass the map room on his way to the stables and glance through the open door. He would see her standing at the long table with a magnifying glass in one hand and a pencil in the other, her honey-brown hair coming loose from its gathering at the nape, a smudge of graphite on her cheek, and he would feel, each time, a small involuntary adjustment in his understanding of what he had done. She was not what he had expected. He had expected competence, because competence was what he had purchased. He had not expected the way she handled the old maps, with a tenderness that bordered on reverence, turning the fragile pages with fingers that knew how to touch something valuable without damaging it. He had not expected the way she spoke to Mr. Ives, the estate surveyor, as a colleague rather than a subordinate, asking questions that demonstrated she already understood the answers, but wanted to hear his reasoning. He had not expected the way she treated Mrs. Halford, with a warmth that was quiet and unperformative, helping to carry the heavy tea tray without being asked, remembering that the housekeeper's left shoulder troubled her in cold weather. What Dominic Vane had not expected, in short, was that the woman he had married as an instrument of his revenge would turn out to be a person. This was inconvenient. Mr. Ives noticed it too. The land surveyor was a quiet man of 40 who had mapped every ditch and hedgerow on the Wrenwick estate, and who regarded the land the way a physician regards a patient, with professional attention and genuine concern. He had been sceptical of the new Duchess. He had expected a society woman who would ask ignorant questions and mishandle the instruments. What he got instead was a woman who picked up his brass measuring chain, examined the links, and said, "This is a Ramsden chain, is it not? My father preferred Gunter's, but he always said Ramsden's links held their calibration better in wet weather." Mr. Ives had looked at her for a long moment, and then he had said, "Your father was correct, Your Grace." And from that point forward he treated her as a colleague, which was, in the vocabulary of a man who did not waste words, the highest compliment he knew how to pay. Mrs. Halford observed the household the way a general observes a battlefield, from a position of elevated awareness, tracking movements and alliances, and the subtle shifts in temperature that precede change. She saw that the Duchess ate little at dinner, but accepted second cups of tea in the map room. She saw that the Duke, who had not entered the map room in 3 years, now passed its door 6 or 7 times a day. She saw that when they spoke at dinner, which was rarely, they spoke about land, about boundaries, about the precise legal meaning of the phrase "from the ancient oak to the water course," and that these conversations, dry as chalk dust on the surface, carried underneath them a current of something that was not yet warmth, but was no longer cold. She reported none of this to anyone. She simply adjusted the household accordingly. She moved the good tea service to the map room sideboard. She ensured the fire there was lit an hour before the Duchess typically arrived. She placed a second chair at the long table, positioned at a comfortable working distance from the first, and she did not comment when, by the end of the 3rd week, both chairs showed signs of regular use. The first real conversation happened on a Tuesday evening in the 4th week, when Marguerite appeared in the dining room with a sheaf of papers and a look on her face that Dominic had not seen before. It was the look of someone who has found what they were looking for and is not entirely sure they are pleased about it. "I have identified 3 discrepancies in the Aldermere boundary surveys," she said, without preamble. She did not sit down. She stood at the near end of the table, close enough that the candlelight caught the amber of her eyes and turned it to something warmer, and she spread the papers between them with the practiced efficiency of a solicitor presenting evidence. Dominic set down his fork. He had been eating roast pheasant without tasting it, which was how he ate most things, and he gave her his full attention with the particular intensity of a man who has waited 11 years for this moment. "The first discrepancy is in the watercourse description," she said, pointing to a passage in the original 1762 survey. "The deed that Lord Maddox holds describes the eastern boundary as following the River Avon to the point where it meets the stone bridge at Harrow Cross, but the original survey describes the boundary as following the river to the Old Mill Weir, 17 chains north of Harrow Cross. Those are 2 different locations. The distance between them is approximately 400 yards, and those 400 yards contain the most productive farmland on the estate." "And the other discrepancies?" She described them with the same precision, the same absence of dramatic emphasis, the same level voice that laid facts end to end and allowed them to speak for themselves. The second discrepancy was in the description of a copse of oaks that had been used as a landmark. The third was in the numbering of the boundary stones themselves, a sequence that had been altered in the deed Maddox held so that stones 4 and 5 were transposed, effectively moving the western boundary a 1/4 mile in Maddox's favour. When she finished, she stood with her hands at her sides and waited. She was not seeking approval. She was presenting findings. The difference was important, and Dominic understood it the way he understood all the things about her that he had not planned for. "You are certain," he said. "I am certain that the deed Lord Maddox holds does not match the original survey. I am certain that the discrepancies are not clerical errors, because clerical errors are random and these are systematic. Every alteration favours the same party. That is not accident, that is design." Dominic felt it then, the thing he had been refusing to feel for 4 weeks. It was not attraction, or not only attraction. It was the particular, devastating recognition that he was sitting across from someone who saw the world the way he saw it, clearly and without sentiment, but who had not allowed that clarity to make her cruel. Marguerite Sinclair looked at the evidence of Lord Maddox's fraud with the same calm precision Dominic brought to his revenge, but her precision was in service of truth rather than punishment, and the difference between those two things was, he realized with a slow and unwelcome clarity, the difference between justice and vengeance. He did not say any of this. He said, "Can you prepare a summary for a barrister?" "I can prepare a summary that would make a barrister weep with gratitude, Your Grace." It was the first time she had come close to humour, and it startled him, not the words themselves, which were dry and precise, but the faint softening at the corners of her mouth, the almost smile that suggested Marguerite Sinclair contained depths of warmth that she kept carefully controlled, the way one controls a fire, not to diminish it, but to prevent it from consuming things that are not yet ready to burn. He found, to his considerable alarm, that he wanted to see that almost smile again. The weeks that followed changed the geometry of the house. Gradually, without either of them acknowledging it directly, the distance between the east wing and the west wing contracted. Dominic began taking his morning tea in the map room rather than his study. Marguerite began leaving her door open in the evenings.
They spoke about boundary lines and legal precedent and the particular habits of North Riding judges, and they spoke with the focused intensity of two people who share a project, and somewhere in the process of sharing that project, they began to share other things. She told him about her father, not the version he had read in the investigator's report, which was a collection of dates and facts, but the real version, the one that lived in the texture of her voice when she described how Edwin Sinclair had taught her to read a land survey before she could read a novel, how he had taken her on walks along parish boundaries and shown her the way a stone wall tells the story of who owned what and when, how he had believed, with the quiet certainty of a man who loved precision, that property law was not about money, but about truth, about the accurate recording of who belongs where and what is theirs by right.
"He would have enjoyed this case," she said one evening, standing by the window with a cup of tea going cold in her hands, looking out at the river. "He believed that forged deeds were a form of violence. He said that when you falsify a boundary, you do not merely steal land, you steal the story of a place, you remove it from the record, and what is removed from the record eventually ceases to exist." Dominic, sitting at the table behind her, felt the stone in his mouth again, not because she was wrong, but because she was right, and because the story she was helping him recover was also the story she did not yet know, the part about his father, and the pistol, and the 4 minutes in the rain. He told her that evening, not all of it, not the worst of it, but enough. He told her that Marcus Vane had lost Aldermere through Maddox's fraud and had spent 3 years trying to recover it through legal channels and had been thwarted at every turn by Maddox's connections and Maddox's money and Maddox's willingness to suborn witnesses, and that the shame of it, the slow erosion of his name, and his purpose, and his belief that the law would protect him, had eventually become more than he could carry. He told her this in the map room, with the candles burning low and the sound of the river through the open window, and he told it in the same plain, controlled voice he used for everything, because if he allowed the voice to break, the rest of him would break with it, and he was not yet ready for that. Marguerite listened without interrupting. She did not reach for his hand. She did not offer comfort or platitude. She sat in the chair across from him, with her tea and her quiet attention, and she let the silence after his words exist without trying to fill it. And that silence, that willingness to hold the weight of what he had said without rushing to set it down, was the most compassionate thing anyone had done for him in 11 years. "I am sorry," she said finally. 2 words. She said them the way she said everything, plainly and without decoration, and they landed with the weight of something real because they were not trying to carry more meaning than they could hold. Dominic nodded. He did not trust his voice. He did not trust the way the candlelight turned her amber eyes to something that looked like understanding, and he did not trust the thing building in his chest, the slow, insistent pressure of a truth he was not ready to name. He was falling in love with her. He knew it the way he knew the boundary stones of his own estate by walking the line and recognizing the landmarks. The way she held a magnifying glass. The way she argued with Mr. Ives about the accuracy of a 70-year-old compass bearing. The way she said, "Your Grace," as though the title were a professional address rather than a measure of his worth. The way she had looked at his marriage terms and understood without being told that generosity without affection is compensation. He was falling in love with her, and he had married her under false pretenses, and the revenge he had built his life around was beginning to feel not like justice but like a thing that might require him to sacrifice the only person who had ever made him feel that the future contained something other than the sound of a pistol shot. Lord Philip Maddox arrived at Wrenwick Hall on a Thursday afternoon in October, uninvited and unannounced, in a carriage drawn by matched chestnuts and attended by a man in livery who looked as though he had been selected for his ability to convey wealth without speaking. Maddox himself was a man of 52 who had spent 3 decades accumulating the particular kind of confidence that comes from never having been successfully challenged. He was not tall. He was not physically imposing. He was, if anything, slightly soft around the middle, with ash-blonde hair receding at the temples and light brown eyes that moved across a room with the unhurried assessment of a man who believes he already knows the value of everything in it. He wore a tobacco-brown velvet coat and a cream silk cravat fixed with a gold pin, and he carried himself with the ease of someone who has long since forgotten what it feels like to be uncertain of his welcome. Dominic received him in the drawing-room with the controlled courtesy of a man who has imagined this meeting 4,000 times and has learned, through sheer repetition, to keep the fury out of his face. "Wrenwick," Maddox said, settling into a chair that was not offered with the comfort of a man sitting in his own parlour. "I was passing through, heard you had married, thought I should congratulate you." "You are kind to call." "Not at all. Neighbours should know each other, particularly neighbours who share a river." Maddox smiled. It was the kind of smile that another man might have mistaken for warmth. Dominic recognized it for what it was, a display, the way a dog shows its teeth, not because it is happy, but because it wants you to see them. Marguerite entered the room before Dominic could prevent it. She had been in the map room, and she came through the connecting door with a sheaf of papers in her hand and graphite on her fingers, and she stopped when she saw Maddox with the sudden stillness of someone who has walked into a room that contains a variable she has not accounted for. Maddox stood. His eyes moved across her, the fawn dress, the cream shawl, the smudged fingers, the honey-brown hair loosening from its gathering, and he smiled again, but differently. With interest. with the calculating attention of a man who evaluates women the way he evaluates property, by estimating their yield. "Your bride, I presume," he said. Dominic watched Marguerite process this. He watched her register the name, the face, the coat, the cravat, the gold pin, and he watched her understand in the space of 3 seconds that this was the man who had destroyed her husband's family, and that her husband had not warned her he might come. She did not falter. She did not look at Dominic for guidance. She extended her hand and said, "Lord Maddox, I have heard the name. You hold the Aldermere estate, I believe." "I do indeed. A fine property. Your husband's family were the previous holders, though I expect he has told you the history." "He has told me a great deal about Aldermere," she said, and her voice contained something that only Dominic could hear, a note of precision that was not for Maddox but for him, a signal that she understood more than she was saying, and that she intended to say nothing more until she had decided exactly how much understanding was safe to reveal. Maddox stayed for tea. He stayed for an hour and 14 minutes, during which he talked about his horses, his rents, his improvements to the Aldermere farmland, and his plans to stand for Parliament, and during which Marguerite poured tea and nodded and asked questions that sounded polite, but which Dominic recognised, with increasing admiration and increasing dread, as diagnostic. She was taking the measure of him. She was evaluating his intelligence, his vanity, his carelessness, and his capacity for self-deception, and she was doing it with the same systematic thoroughness she brought to the survey maps. After Maddox left, Dominic stood at the drawing-room window and watched the carriage disappear down the drive, and felt something he had not felt in 11 years. Fear, not of Maddox, of himself, of what he had set in motion and what it would cost. Marguerite appeared beside him. She did not speak immediately. She stood at the window and looked at the empty drive, and then she said, without turning her head, "You did not bring me here only for the records." It was not a question. "No," Dominic said. "You brought me here because you needed someone in this house when he came. Someone who could speak to him, observe him, learn his patterns. Someone who could be useful in ways that go beyond reading surveys." Yes. The silence that followed was not comfortable. It was the kind of silence that lives between two people when one of them has just confirmed what the other suspected, and the confirmation changes everything. "Is there anything else you have not told me?" she asked. Dominic turned to face her. She was looking at him with her amber eyes steady, and her hands still, and her expression composed, and he recognized with a clarity that hurt more than he had expected that this was the moment. This was the fulcrum. He could lie to her one more time, and the lie would be easy, and the plan would continue, and Maddox would eventually be exposed, and Aldermere would be recovered, and none of it would be worth the thing he would lose in the lying. "Your father's practice," he said. "The lease. It was not a coincidence." He watched it land. He watched her understand, the slight tightening of her jaw, the momentary closing of her eyes, the breath she took that was deeper than the breath before it. He watched the composure hold, because Marguerite Sinclair's composure was not a performance, but a discipline, earned through years of being the kind of woman who could not afford to be seen breaking, and he watched the composure cost her something, and the cost was visible only in her hands, which tightened on the windowsill until her knuckles showed white. "You engineered my circumstances," she said. "Yes. You made me desperate so that I would accept your terms." "Yes. And the terms themselves, the settlement, the access, the map room, all of it designed not for my benefit but for yours. The terms were genuine. Everything I offered you will keep. Regardless of what happens next, regardless of whether you choose to stay or leave, the settlement is yours and the terms are binding." "That is not the point, Your Grace." "No," he said quietly. It is not. She released the windowsill. She stepped back from him, not dramatically, not with the sweeping gesture of a woman in a novel, but with the small, precise movement of someone who needs to create distance in order to think clearly, the way a surveyor steps back from a boundary stone to see how it aligns with the landscape. "I need time," she said. "You have it, as much as you need." She left the room. She did not close the door behind her. She left it open, and Dominic stood in the drawing room with the autumn light fading through the window and the sound of her footsteps on the stone floor growing quieter, and he understood, with the terrible clarity of a man who has just destroyed the best thing he ever had, that revenge is a form of architecture. You build it carefully, over years, and you furnish it with purpose, and you live inside it so long that you forget it is a prison, and by the time you realize you want to leave, you have bricked up all the doors. 3 days passed. Marguerite did not appear at dinner. She did not appear in the map room. She did not leave the house, Mrs. Halford reported, but she did not emerge from her rooms except to walk in the garden in the early mornings, before the household was awake, when the mist still lay on the river and the willows dripped with cold condensation. Dominic did not seek her out. He understood, with the painful humility of a man who has been wrong about something fundamental, that seeking her out would be another form of using her, that his desire for forgiveness was not more important than her need for space, and that the most respectful thing he could do for the woman he loved was to let her decide, without pressure, whether she wanted anything to do with him. Mrs. Halford brought tea to the East Wing 3 times a day and reported back with the economy of a woman who understood that her employer's heart was breaking and that the breaking was deserved. "She is reading," Mrs. Halford said on the second day. "Reading what?" "The survey records, Your Grace. She took them to her rooms." Dominic closed his eyes. The fact that Marguerite, betrayed and furious and fully justified in walking out of this house and this marriage and this man's life, was still reading the survey records, was either a sign of extraordinary professional dedication or a sign that she cared about the case more than she cared about her anger, and either way, it told him something about her character that he did not deserve to know. On the morning of the 4th day, Dominic came downstairs to find Marguerite in the map room. She was standing at the long table with the original 1762 survey unrolled before her, and her brown leather notebook open beside it, and she was working. Her hair was gathered loosely at the nape. Her amber eyes were focused on the page. She was wearing the fawn dress with the mended cuff, and she looked exactly as she had looked on the first day he had met her, with the single difference that she now looked at him when she raised her eyes from the survey, with full knowledge of who he was. "I have completed the analysis," she said. Her voice was level. Her hands were steady. "The case is strong. The discrepancies are clear, systematic, and provable. I believe a competent barrister could present this evidence to the North Riding Assizes and secure a judgment within 6 months. Marguerite, I am not finished." She set down her pencil. "I have also written to Miss Denny in Clerkenwell and asked her to locate a Mr. James Pratt, who was the surveyor contracted by Lord Maddox to produce the fraudulent deed. Miss Denny knows everyone in the Clerkenwell legal district, and Mr. Pratt, based on the handwriting analysis I conducted yesterday, is the man who physically altered the boundary descriptions. If he can be located and deposed, the case becomes not merely strong but unanswerable." Dominic stood in the doorway. He did not move. He did not speak. He waited, because the words she had spoken were professional, and the words she had not yet spoken were personal, and the space between them was where the rest of his life would be decided. Marguerite looked at him. She looked at him for a long time, with the amber eyes that missed very little and forgave even less. "You used me," she said. You engineered my circumstances and you married me under false pretenses, and you allowed me to work in this room for weeks without telling me the full truth of why I was here. You treated me as an instrument. Yes, that was wrong. Yes, and you know it was wrong not because someone told you it was wrong, but because you, yourself, in the process of watching me work and live and exist as a person in your house, came to understand that I am not an instrument, that I am a woman with my own mind and my own history and my own reasons for caring about the accuracy of boundary stones. Yes, he said, and his voice, for the first time in 11 years, was not controlled. It was not steady. It was the voice of a man who has spent 4,000 days building a fortress and has just realized that the person he wants to live with is standing outside it. Marguerite nodded. Slowly. Once. Then we will continue, she said. Not because you have earned my trust, because you have not, and not because I forgive the manipulation, because I do not forgive it yet, and I may not forgive it for a long time. We will continue because the case is real. Your father was wronged. The deeds are forged. The land was stolen. And those things are true regardless of how I came to be the person who proved them. She picked up her pencil. She returned her attention to the survey. The conversation, as far as she was concerned, was over. Dominic stood in the doorway and felt something he had not felt since he was 19 years old and standing in the rain outside a study door. Hope. Fragile. Undeserved. Real. The weeks that followed were different. The geometry of the house did not change. The east wing and the west wing maintained their separate dominions, but the quality of the space between them shifted. Marguerite appeared at dinner again, seated now at the near end of the table rather than the far end, close enough for conversation, though not for intimacy, and the distance she maintained was not punitive, but considered, the boundary of a woman who is deciding day by day whether the ground she stands on is solid enough to support weight. She spoke to Dominic about the case and only the case. She did not ask about his mornings or his riding or his correspondence. She did not inquire after his health when he appeared at breakfast, with shadows under his pale green eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. She maintained the cool, professional distance of a solicitor working with a difficult client, and Dominic accepted it, because acceptance was the only honest thing he had left to offer. But there were moments, small ones, visible only to someone paying close attention, and Mrs. Halford was always paying close attention. A Tuesday evening, when Marguerite made a wry observation about the penmanship of the 1762 surveyor, comparing his handwriting to a spider that had fallen into an inkwell and made a valiant attempt to escape across the page. And Dominic had laughed, genuinely, for the first time in months, and Marguerite had looked at him with surprise, and then with something that was almost, not quite, a smile. A Thursday morning, when Mr. Ives brought news that the boundary stone at the western edge of Aldermere had been recently moved, probably by one of Maddox's labourers, and Marguerite had said, "We should document that immediately," and the "we" had been instinctive, unplanned, and had hung in the air between them like a seed that neither of them acknowledged, but both of them noticed. Miss Denny wrote from Clerkenwell. She had located Mr. Pratt, the surveyor, and her letter described the man with the unsparing directness of a woman who had spent 30 years as a landlady in a legal district and had developed an infallible instinct for assessing character. "He is a man of weak constitution and weaker resolve," Miss Denny wrote, "and he has been drinking his way through what I suspect is a considerable guilt. I believe he will cooperate if approached with firmness and the assurance that his cooperation will be noted by the court." Marguerite read this letter aloud to Dominic in the map room, and when she finished, she folded it and placed it in her folio and said, "Miss Denny is a remarkable woman. She sounds formidable. She is the kind of woman who remembers the name of every tenant in her building, the date their rent is due, and the precise nature of their shortcomings. She once evicted a man for persistent dishonesty about his cat. It was the most personal thing Marguerite had said to him in weeks, and Dominic received it with the care of a man who has been given something fragile and knows better than to grip it too tightly. The case came before the North Riding Assizes on a cold morning in January, in a courtroom that smelled of damp wool and old wood and the particular anxiety of men who have staked their reputations on outcomes they cannot control. Lord Philip Maddox sat in the gallery with his gold cravat pin and his tobacco-brown coat and his light brown eyes that had, for the first time in Dominic's memory, a quality of unease about them, the look of a man who has been comfortable for so long that the first stirring of discomfort feels catastrophic. Marguerite was not in the gallery. She was at the counsel's table, seated beside the barrister, a Mr. Aldridge, whom Dominic had retained from London, and she was there because Mr. Aldridge had reviewed her analysis and had told Dominic, in a private meeting the previous week, that Miss Sinclair, forgive me, the Duchess, understood the survey evidence better than any expert witness he could engage, and that if she were willing to present the technical findings herself, the case would be stronger for it. She was willing. She had said so in the same level voice she used for everything, and Dominic had learned over the preceding months that the level voice was not a sign of indifference but of absolute focus, the voice of a woman who has decided something and does not need to raise her volume to make the decision real. She presented the evidence for 2 hours and 40 minutes. She stood before the judge with the original survey maps mounted on a board that Mr.
Ives had constructed for the purpose, and she walked through the 3 discrepancies with the patience and clarity of someone who understands that judges, like boundary stones, must be approached in sequence and with respect for their position. She did not dramatize. She did not editorialize. She laid the facts end to end and let them form a line that pointed with geometric inevitability to a single conclusion. Maddox's barrister, a Mr. Cavendish with a florid face and the confident bearing of a man accustomed to winning on reputation rather than evidence, attempted to challenge her qualifications. He asked whether she had formal training in surveying. She said she did not. He asked whether she held any professional appointment. She said she did not.
He asked with the faint condescension of a man who believes he is about to win a point, whether she was aware that the interpretation of survey records was typically performed by qualified land agents, not by the wives of interested parties. Marguerite looked at him with the same steady amber gaze she had turned on Dominic in the boarding-house parlour, the gaze that measured and assessed and did not flinch. "I am aware of the convention, sir," she said. "I am also aware that the qualified land agent who produced the fraudulent survey was paid £30 to do so. Convention, in this instance, does not appear to have been a guarantee of accuracy." The courtroom was silent for 3 full seconds. Mr. Aldridge, beside her, pressed his lips together in the particular way of a barrister who is trying not to smile in front of a judge. Mr. Cavendish sat down. She continued. She showed the judge the original 1762 boundary markers, traced the watercourse on the mounted map with her finger, and demonstrated, stone by stone and chain by chain, how every alteration in Maddox's deed moved a line in the same direction. She spoke without notes. She referred to distances, dates, and legal descriptions from memory, and her memory was faultless because the precision she brought to land records was not academic but constitutional, the expression of a mind that had been built from childhood to hold detail as a form of respect for truth. The deeds held by Lord Philip Maddox were forged. The boundaries had been altered. The land had been stolen. Mr. Pratt, the surveyor, had been located by Miss Denny in a boarding-house in Southwark and had, upon being informed that his participation in the fraud had been independently documented, agreed to provide a deposition confirming that Lord Maddox had paid him £30 to alter the boundary descriptions in 1805. The deposition was entered into evidence, and when it was read aloud, Dominic watched Maddox's face and saw something he had imagined 4,000 times, but which, in reality, looked nothing like what he had expected. He had imagined rage or defiance, or the dramatic collapse of a man confronted with his crimes. What he saw instead was something smaller and sadder. He saw a man realize that the thing he had built his comfort on was hollow, and that the hollowness had been there all along, and that everyone in this room could see it now. Maddox did not collapse. He sat very still, with his hands on his knees, and his ash-blonde hair caught the grey light from the high windows, and he looked old. He looked, for the first time, like a man who would have to live with what he had done. The judge ruled in Dominic's favour. Aldermere was to be restored to the Vane estate. Maddox was ordered to pay damages and costs. The forged deeds were declared void. Dominic stood in the courtroom after the judgment was read and waited to feel what he had always imagined he would feel. Triumph, vindication, the closing of a circle that had been open for 11 years. He did not feel it. He felt tired. He felt emptied. He felt, with a clarity that surprised him, that the thing he had wanted most in the world, for more than a decade, was not the thing he wanted most anymore. He looked at Marguerite. She was gathering her papers at the council's table, sliding them into the brown leather folio she had carried into the boarding-house parlour on the first day they met, and she moved with the same calm efficiency she brought to everything. And she did not look at him, and the fact that she did not look at him contained more information than any survey map he had ever read. He had won the case. He did not yet know if he had lost her. Spring came to Wrenwick Hall, the way spring comes to the north of England, reluctantly, in fits and starts, with cold mornings giving way to afternoons that held, briefly and then for longer, the warmth of something cautiously returning. The willows along the river put out their first pale green leaves. The garden, which had been untended for years and which Marguerite had begun, quietly and without announcing it, to clear and replant, showed the first shoots of lavender and thyme and the white stubborn heads of snowdrops pushing through the cold earth. The Aldermere tenants came to Wrenwick in March, a delegation of 4 men in heavy coats and mud-caked boots who stood in the front hall with their hats in their hands and asked to speak to the Duke. Dominic received them in the drawing-room, and Marguerite, who had not been invited, appeared at the door with her leather folio and her measuring chain, and said, "If you are discussing boundaries, I should be present." Nobody argued. The tenants explained that 3 of their field boundaries had been quietly altered during Maddox's tenure, hedgerows moved, ditches filled, fences repositioned in ways that gave Maddox's home farm an additional 12 acres at the tenants' expense. Marguerite listened, made notes, and told them she would walk the boundaries herself the following week. She did. She walked every disputed line with Mr. Ives and a tape measure, and returned with a report that was 4 pages long and entirely conclusive. The boundaries were restored within a fortnight. The tenants, who had spent a decade losing ground an inch at a time, did not thank her with words. They thanked her with the particular silence of men who have been heard for the first time and do not need to say so. Dominic walked the Aldermere boundary on a Tuesday in April, alone, for the first time since it had been restored. He walked every stone. He touched the markers that his great-grandfather had placed and that Mr. Pratt had lied about, and that Marguerite had identified, one by one, with a pencil and a magnifying glass, and an integrity that he had done nothing to deserve. When he returned to Wrenwick, he found her in the map room. She was not working on the Aldermere records, which were complete and filed. She was reading a new set of documents, land records from a neighbouring parish which she had requested from the county archive, using her standing as Duchess, and which she was examining with the same focused attention she brought to everything. "What are these?" he asked from the doorway. "The Arden Farm surveys," she said without looking up. Mr. Ives mentioned that the tenant, a Mr. Bilson, believes his western boundary has been incorrectly recorded for 20 years. I told him I would look into it. Dominic leaned against the doorframe. "You are taking on clients." I am taking on the work that needs to be done, Your Grace. There are a great many boundaries in this county that have not been properly checked in decades, and I have the training, the access, and apparently the title to do something about it." She looked up then. For the first time in weeks, there was something in her expression that was not guarded, not careful, not held at the precise professional distance she had maintained since the day he had told her the truth. There was something that looked, in the amber light of the north-facing windows, very much like the beginning of a decision. "You could call me Dominic," he said quietly. She regarded him. She did not smile, but the line of her mouth softened, and her hands on the map stilled, and she said, "You could earn that." He understood. He understood that earning it would not be a single gesture, not a declaration, or a ring, or a grand romantic action, but a process, a slow and daily accumulation of honesty, the way a boundary line is established not by a single stone, but by stone after stone, each one placed with care, and each one verifiable, and each one pointing, if you followed them, to the same truth. He began that afternoon. He brought her tea without being asked. He sat at the table beside her and read while she worked, not hovering, not waiting, simply being present in the way that a person is present when they have chosen to be in a room, not because they need something from it, but because the room is where they want to be. One evening, he found her struggling with a survey map that had been folded incorrectly and was tearing at the creases. The map was from 1791, inked on linen-backed paper that had grown brittle with age, and Marguerite was holding the two halves together with her fingertips, her face tight with the particular distress of someone who understands that a damaged record is a kind of wound in the historical body. Dominic crossed the room without speaking. He took one edge of the map in his hands, holding it gently, and together they unfolded it flat on the table, working in silence, their fingers moving carefully along the torn edge until the map lay open and whole and readable. It took 11 minutes. Neither of them spoke during those 11 minutes, and the silence was not the cold silence of the dining room or the charged silence of the drawing room after Maddox's visit. It was the functional silence of two people engaged in the same careful work, and when it was done, Marguerite looked at the map and then looked at him and said, "Thank you." 2 words, but she said them differently than she had said them before. She said them the way you thank someone who has understood, without being told, that the thing you are holding is fragile and important and worth the effort of care. He told her, over the following weeks, about his father. Not the version he had told her before, the strategic version, the version that served the case, the real version. The gentle man who had read to him in the evenings, and who had taught him to ride, and who had believed until the believing killed him that the law would protect him. He told her about the 4 minutes in the rain. He told her about the sound the door made when he opened it. He told her these things in the map room, at the table, with no one listening, and Marguerite listened the way she always listened, with her full attention and her silence and her unwillingness to fill the space with anything less than what it required. And somewhere in those weeks, somewhere between the tea and the surveys and the evenings when the candles burned low and neither of them moved to relight them, the distance closed. Not dramatically, not with a kiss or a declaration, with something smaller and more durable. A hand placed over his on the table, a name used for the first time. "Dominic," she said one evening, and the sound of his name in her voice, the level, calm, undecorated voice that carried no more weight than it needed to carry, was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. Not because it was romantic, because it was honest, because she had chosen to say it, and the choice was hers, fully and without manipulation, and that was what made it mean something. "Marguerite," he said back. She looked at him. Her amber eyes held something that was not forgiveness, not yet, not entirely, but was its close neighbour, the recognition that a person can do wrong and know it and choose differently, and that the choosing differently is, in the end, all that any of us can offer. "I am staying," she said. "Not because of the settlement, not because of the title, not because I have nowhere else to go, because we both know that I do. Miss Denny has offered me rooms, and there are 3 parishes that would pay me to survey their boundaries, and I have enough professional standing now to support myself. I am staying because this is where I want to be. I am staying because the work is real, and the house is good, and the river is beautiful, and because you, despite everything, are the only person who has ever looked at what I do and understood that it matters." Dominic reached across the table. He placed his hand over hers, carefully, the way one touches a map that is old and fragile and contains the truth of something important. She did not pull away. She turned her hand under his and held it, and her grip was firm and warm and steady, and it felt like a boundary stone, like a fixed point, like something that would still be there when you came back to check. The morning was cold and bright, the kind of April morning in the north that promises nothing but delivers, if you are paying attention, everything. Frost on the window panes catching the early light, the river running high and clear, the willows moving in a wind that came from somewhere distant and carried the smell of wet earth and new growth. Marguerite was in the map room. She was always in the map room, and the room had become, over the months, unmistakably hers. There were books on the shelves that had not been there before, volumes of survey methodology and property law, and a battered copy of Camden's Britannia that she had inherited from her father, and which she treated with the same careful reverence she brought to everything she loved. There was a vase of snowdrops on the windowsill, white and clean and slightly improbable, flowers that had no business surviving the cold, but survived it anyway. Dominic entered with tea. 2 cups prepared the way she preferred, strong with a little milk and no sugar, and he set one beside her papers and sat in the chair opposite with his own, and looked at her, and felt with the quiet certainty of a man who has finally stopped building prisons, the simple, unremarkable peace of a morning shared with someone who has chosen to be there. On the table between them lay a folded land deed. Not the forged deed, not the Aldermere survey. A new deed, drawn up by Mr. Aldridge and signed by Dominic and witnessed by Mrs. Halford, which transferred 40 acres of Wrenwick land, the parcel along the river where the willows grew, into Marguerite's name alone. Not as part of the marriage settlement, not as compensation, as recognition, as a boundary stone of his own, placed with care and pointing toward a truth he was still learning to live inside. Marguerite had read the deed when he gave it to her the previous evening. She had read it with the same focused attention she gave to every legal document, and she had set it down, and she had looked at him, and she had said nothing for a very long time. And then she had said, 40 acres is too many, and he had said, 40 acres is exact, and she had looked at the deed again, and she had understood that the 40 acres were the same 400 yards that Maddox had stolen through forged boundaries, the productive farmland between the old mill weir and Harrow Cross, the land that her analysis had recovered, the land that she had earned through precision and patience, and the refusal to accept a boundary line that did not match the evidence. The deed lay between them now, folded, with its seal of dark green wax that bore the Vane crest, and neither of them moved it, and neither of them needed to, because it was not going anywhere. It was a fixed point. It was a record. It was the kind of document that Marguerite's father would have recognized as what property law is really about. Not ownership, but truth. Not possession, but the accurate recording of what belongs to whom and why. Dominic drank his tea. Marguerite picked up her pencil and returned to the Arden Farm surveys, and the sound of graphite on paper filled the room with the particular quiet industry of a woman who has found her purpose and intends to pursue it for a very long time. Outside the window, the willows moved. The river ran. The frost on the glass dissolved slowly into drops of water that caught the light and fell, one by one, into the morning. It was enough. It was, in fact, everything.